When you connected with us at Architect Knowhow, this means providing information that would be of value to you whilst you were at university as a student, and if you are in architectural practice as a qualified architect. It will also provide you with a heads up in your transition from university architecture to architecture in practice. It's like having advance notice of what's coming your way when you get qualified and start in practice. Architect Knowhow will deal with the enjoyable aspects of being an architect, and there are quite a few of those, as well as the challenges you will face. And it will also help you to what to watch out for, really. In this video then, I will take you through some typical scenarios associated with engaging with your client on a project. That is, the startup activities and what you should be thinking about. Getting things in place, in other words. I will also be covering aspects associated with your architect's appointment and why it is very important to have some formal arrangement in place with your client. An awful lot of young practitioners I see don't have that in place, and they can find themselves in a measure of difficulty. So we will take a look at the overall project and what you might expect. We will dig into what the architect's appointment is and why getting this in place is vital for an architect. And then I will outline some aspects surrounding the project brief that really you should be aware of. So moving on then with this video, because I want to get into the very essence of starting an architectural project. In other words, how to start, how to know where to begin. Therefore, I want to give you a general overview of project situations and where you as an architect might come into the mix. These slides really are a gentle introduction about functioning as an architect in practice. I will also be taking you through the very essence of starting a project with your client and getting yourselves organized. Now that's the most important thing, is knowing how to get yourself organized. So how does this project come about? I mean, how's a project born? Well, let us start then by me showing you the process at the very beginning of a project coming into existence. In other words, the project might be just a notion, a dream even, in the head of a potential client. Some client out there that's looking at a parcel of land that you don't even know about yet. For you, being the potential architect for this particular project that is being incubated in that client's head, this is always a potential opportunity. So there are always being client sites being looked at by clients, and it's maybe you're recommended and then you're put in front of them as a potential architect. So just to provide some context to the project then, let's assume the project to be a simple residential project, like a new house or an extension to a property. Alternatively, we could assume as well it might be more substantial in size and indeed in complexity as well. Let's say, for instance, a small office development maybe, or a factory premises. It could be even a leisure centre or even a school building. And we've done quite a lot of school buildings and leisure centres. It doesn't matter really what type of project it might be, as the process will remain the same when it comes to the initial engagement with your client and identifying what the project will consist of. Now, I will say to you that whilst I have found every project will be different in different ways for different reasons, this process of getting to grips with the project and getting yourself organized will always remain the same. For now though, nothing exists. Let's assume that for you. Our potential client out there is merely thinking about a possible development for a particular parcel of land, and you or your firm, let's assume, are known to the client now. Clearly, that is always a good place to be. I have found it's at least be in the mix, but it is not a bankable project for you yet, not at this stage. Now, you'll probably hear me mention about bankable project, bankable document, and I say that for very good reason, actually, because a bankable document means it's something you can count on. So now I'm just going to have a look at what a new project opportunity might mean for you. So depending on the nature of the development being considered, that really will dictate where and when you, the architect, will become involved. And there are a number of possible situations. The first would be where you, say, are invited to engage with your client from the point zero. That means he's done nothing on the site, he hasn't given it no considerations, he's got a parcel of land, could be a she of course, or it could be a company, they, etc. That is, your client is thinking about a possible development for a parcel of land with or without an existing building. So your client owns this parcel of land, or your client is considering purchasing a parcel of land, and your architectural advice and expertise is required. Voila! So your client will be better understand then what might be possible from you as his architectural advisor. Ooh, no pressure then. So in my experience of such situations, the client's primary focus is usually on achieving that elusive planning permission. 9 times out of 10 it is, I have found that. This will enable your client to proceed, of course, to the next phase, which will either be to sell the development site with a planning permission, that's A, or B perhaps, build out the project himself or herself for their own specific use and then sell it on as a completed development. So you probably have that scenario. The other scenario, of course, is if it's a simple domestic property, they know what they want to live in it, they want to build it out and live in it, fine. So in the case of a domestic property owner or a business owner seeking to expand their properties for their own specific use, they tend to build out the project. So it would be reasonable to assume your commission will be for the full duration of the project, assuming, of course, all goes well and as intended. Now, I have also found, as a general rule, speculators seek to achieve a planning permission as a means to add value only, and then armed with that valuable bankable document planning permission, will sell the whole development on as a completed development. So somebody else will take it on and build it out. That is the nature of their business really, whereas developers tend to build out the project themselves. Now it's worth highlighting here that a planning permission here is the bankable document. That's where the added value is, as I referred to earlier. Okay, so as a general rule, the developer client usually intends to build out the project. That is what they are good at. That is where they make their profit. That's where their expertise is. And they are good also at making profit. I can give you a first-hand guarantee on that. The developer clients, however, will usually acquire the land with an existing planning permission, or they might be taking advantage of an option to purchase the land once the planning permission is achieved. There are occasions too where a developer will buy a parcel of land with an existing planning permission and sees an opportunity perhaps to enhance that existing planning permission with a fresh application and thereby increase the added value. So this may be where you come in. Now I'm just going to take a moment here just to focus on a very important issue that I know I'm going to be covering in other videos and maybe later in these videos as well. But I want to highlight this aspect of planning conditions. Now, you remember earlier in this, just a few moments ago, I referred to a client maybe buying a planning permission. Sorry, not buying buying a site with a planning permission. And he's engaged you to have a look at the viability of this, what he's thinking of buying, and he says, William, would you have a look at this? I just want to make sure that the numbers are going to stack up. So the first thing I always dive into is not the planning permission, that's fine, it's the conditions, the planning conditions. They are lethal, they are dynamite for an architect. If you don't recognize that there are planning permissions, even look at the document. I know clients have gone ahead with other people and they bought a site and they never refer to the planning conditions, and there could be tons of problems, cost implications, time implications, and you need to be wise and alert at least that these planning conditions exist. So just bear that in mind. We'll come on to this particular topic later on. I know I've referred it to elsewhere, and I'll come on to that also. So let's just push on then with the way I had this video planned out in my head. That is, there are occasions also where the developer client finds themselves in a particular financial situation where selling on the development project with a planning permission is an attractive option. Financially, that is. So selling on then might be due to a shortfall in funds suddenly, and that happens, or the funds are needed to get involved in a larger development project where there's even more profits perhaps. But as an architect involved somewhere within the mix of all of this, you are not necessarily involved in the decision-making process, but you do naturally have a vested interest. That is why you're in business as a practicing architect. So in other words, you really have some skin in the game, and depending where you're involved, where you're at with the project. So keeping a close eye on the maneuverings, therefore, becomes a necessary habit eventually, I have found anyway, and you get good at it. So with numerous possible situations that might exist for you with your client, it's always useful to have a basic understanding of your client's game plan, what the thinking is or might be, and where you fit in to the process. Again, that word, process. Keeping your antenna up to scan the airways and your wing mirrors out at all times to see what might be coming up behind is always a worthwhile endeavour. I learned that from a partner in a practice that when I was a young junior partner in a practice many years ago. I had some great mentors actually, so I'm sort of drawn on that when during my years in practice as well. So getting back to the planning aspect though, the first is to achieve is that planning permission, because really without a planning permission your project stops for your client. Equally, of course, for you as the architect, that might be the end of the project for you also. So moving on then, for every architect, the big prize of course is your architectural design project winning that new commission. But before you start any work on the project, you as the architects have to be in the right place with your client, and you'll see why this is so important as I graduate through the video here. This means having some formal arrangement with your client. I know I mentioned that very quickly earlier on, but now I'm coming into the nitty-gritty on this particular aspect. The big prize for every architect is winning that project and of course being appointed. And depending on how advanced you are in your architectural career will indicate, of course, the nature or type of project that's in question. For instance, your big prize project might be a simple residential project, which is where many of us begin, or it could be a project of more substance in size and complexity, which is where we all want to arrive at, and some of us are fortunate enough to get those opportunities. In my architectural career, I've done many different types of projects, both as an employed architect, as a salaried architect, and as a partner in a large London practice I mentioned earlier on, and finally as principal of my own practice, which I led for over 35 years. Whatever type of project really you may be targeting, it means of course you are doing it for real. Now this means having some understanding of what is involved when it comes to managing the processes for taking your project from the beginning to the end. Now, doing it for real as an architect in practice also means you will have an architect's appointment already in place with your client. That's the reality of it. Your architect's appointment might be for the entire project, covering all the RIBA work stages, or it might be up to a certain work stage initially, which is not uncommon. Your appointment might also mean a simple exchange of letters, let's say, between you and your client, setting out your terms on what professional services your clients can expect from you. And with either of these in place, you are ready to get to work on an architect you're ready to get to work. Let me get my thoughts clear. You're ready to get to work on your architectural design project for real. You're also, of course, complying with the ARB rules, which is very important for every qualified architect, and this means making sure you have your professional indemnity insurance in place also. Now, I'm covering this professional indemnity topic in a future tutorial, so I won't go into detail here, except to say that before you start a project, you need to have that in place. There is a minimum insurance, professional indemnity insurance cover that you have to have in place. So again, we're still focusing on the big prize, but in this particular section here, I want to refer to the RIBA plan of work stages. Now, as a qualified architect in practice, you might be in practice as an employed architect or as a salaried architect, I referred to that earlier, within an architectural firm, or you might be starting out in your own architectural practice. Either way, when you are qualified, you are working as an architect. You are in practice, in actual fact, and therefore take on the responsibilities of a practicing professional. Consequently, there is a process for you to follow as a practicing architect. At this point, I want to highlight again that your project will follow a process. I keep highlighting the word process and being organized. Indeed, every project follows a process, and this is a very important aspect for every practicing architect to get a grip of from the beginning. Your project does not begin with you starting to produce design ideas immediately. That comes later, and I'll cover that later when I come on to talk about the right time for doing conceptual design development. The process begins, therefore, for the architect with the RIBA plan of work stages. They're really a good reference point. So it starts really with plan of work stage 0, and your project will follow through all the work stages, ending with work stage 6, which is the project handover. And this is really when you issue your final certificate. This is a big moment for an architect because it has big responsibilities attached to it as well. Now, whilst work stage 7 deals with the building usage, but the main event for the architect is arriving at work stage 6 as handover. This is the point where you are signing off the building with your final certificate as being fit for occupation, and confirming also the building fulfills your design intention and specification. So you can see why it's important. So using the RIBA plan of work, I'm going to focus on the first 3 work stages. That is where you will see the process relating to the beginning of the project with your client and preparing a planning permission for a planning decision. Let's here have a look at these work stages and project the delivery process within each of these work stages. Your project will be taken through a series of events and activities, all of which form that process I keep referring to. The nature and extent of the process you will have to follow for your project will be dictated by its size, level of complexity, or the degree of specialization, or a combination of all these factors. By following the RIBA work stages, however, you will have a clear roadmap to follow. It's a very good way of just keeping yourself organized. I know we all deviate in various aspects, and in many ways that can be dictated by the activities of the project, but you should have a clear sort of grounding on where you're going, what your roadmap is, and you can, of course, you can take a side turn to achieve X, Y, and Z, but you must come back to the main roadmap that I've referred to earlier, which is the RIBA work stages. But just getting back to where I want to deliver on this video, finally on matters relating to delivering the overall development project, it is important to note that irrespective of your project size, complexity even, and specialism, etc., you will still adhere to the RIBA work stages as a process template to follow. I believe it is a good way to follow. Now, I know for this video we're focusing on just stages 0, 1, and 2. They're the first 3 stages that I mentioned earlier. I know it goes on into technical design and also detailed design, and then the RIBA stages will take you through to the tendering process. That's all part of the process. So they include essentially the technical and detailed design, as I said, detailing with tendering. I'm just sort of collecting my thoughts again, and indeed construction on site, and all that will entail, and that's something else. Again, all these topics I will cover in future tutorials and videos, because they are separate issues that crop up, and each one of them have a story to tell. Now, I expect many of you creatives watching this video are already acquainted maybe with the RIBA work stages, but sometimes if you are a new practitioner functioning on the front lines, as it were, you may not be too certain about the importance of starting off with your clients correctly and how that's done, and maybe you are not fully alert or skilled enough in how to avoid leaving yourself exposed professionally, that is, of course, as a consequence. Now, of course, in every project, every client, again, depending on its size and what's involved, he might have his own support team. I always sort of try and separate that thinking out as a client development support team. They're his own back office staff that he has working, and they come in all forms. And it's worth highlighting for you also that the size, again, and complexity associated with your project will dictate various types of other players that may be brought into the development project by your client. And of course, they will have an impact on how you do things, not negatively, but there will be an overlap of activities. Now, and if your client is an experienced developer, whether large or small, they will have a good understanding as to what additional expertise will be necessary to have in place for a given project. Remember, your remit as a design professional, that is the lead consultant, will be to collaborate with other construction professionals. That comes with the job, I'm afraid. There are various views and opinions expressed within the construction industry as to the status and value the architect brings to the table. Just so you know what to expect, I've had various views and opinions expressed in many different ways. Now, by the way, you may not like the ideas of others having views about architects, but that's the way of it, as I alluded to earlier. And speaking of views and likes, Mario has asked me to mention, if you like what is being shared with you in this video so far, your like is also much appreciated, and apparently it's very helpful with the algorithm machine thing. It helps getting the information out there to others, and naturally we'd like to do that. Other players in the mix, as I was referring to earlier, might be a project manager, could be site agent, cost controller, of various levels of intensity. It usually starts with a quantity surveyor, but not all. Some contractors have cost controllers that are not necessarily RICS quantity surveyors. And of course you'll have health and safety advisors, and you may have selling agents appointed by the client, and other consultants too, connected more directly with the overall development delivery process, but not necessarily with the design and specification elements of the development project that we're referring to here. That would be really under the remit of the architect, which is your appointment. Now, you would be the architect or the lead designer. But let me help differentiate here between the use of the word architect for the project and that of lead design consultant. You've obviously heard that mentioned. Well, whilst the word architect will always apply to every project, large or small, lead design consultant will apply where a project is of such a size and complexity with other specialist design consultants will be required. Clearly there is a there's a usual requirement for a structural engineer, the building services engineer, maybe. Now I say maybe with regard to building services because there are a number of ways of dealing with building services for a specific project, and not every project dictates the necessity to engage a building services engineer consultant. And again, I'll discuss that in other videos because I know it's important. But they are nonetheless a member of a design team for many projects. So specialist design therefore represents a sphere of specific design expertise that is clearly outside the design expertise of the architect, which is you. The design of a theatre, for instance, will necessitate specific design expertise beyond that of an architect. Usually, I have found, unless you're a specialist architect that deals in nothing else but theatres. The specialist knowledge required for lighting, acoustics and seating arrangements and sightlines, etc. is not an everyday occurrence for an architect, and usually outside his or her level of design expertise. Some of us might become experts in certain specialisms. I have my own. It's not theatre design, I might add, but it is something else. We can talk about that some other time. Equally, to give another example, a swimming pool complex will always benefit from the knowledge and expertise of a pool design specialist in terms of its structural engineering, mechanical services, which are phenomenal for a pool. I didn't realise that when we got until we were appointed for a very big pool complex, and specialist specification requirements also. I was delighted we had a pool specialist actually. It was I will have to say it was a godsend really. I could sort of just breathe and control the design coordination much easier. I'm not a pool specialist. How could I be? So you bring that in, or the client brings it in, rightly so, and you advise your client to bring it in. So there we are. So I'm going to move on now and start talking about why you need to be collaborating with others. For you as the architect downstroke lead design consultant, however, your focus will be on matters relating to the overall design coordination of the building. I just mentioned that a few moments ago. And although there may be other activities or even design aspects about the development project that will overlap, your remit as the lead design consultant will be essentially to coordinate your architectural design as a structural design, building services, and any other specialist design into the total design of the building. That's your responsibility, and this will require you to collaborate with others. Now, they may not necessarily be in your immediate design team. As I said, there could be specialists, and you have to collaborate with them on behalf of your client. The primary issue for an architect will be recognizing where your responsibility begins and ends as the lead design consultant. But I would suggest your responsibility will always be for the overall design coordination and input of specialist expertise into your architectural design. Taking a close look at the planning process and the role of architects specifically when it comes to preparing a planning submission and obtaining a planning decision. And again, on the nature and extent of your project, its size and complexity, etc., will dictate at what point do you introduce any specialist design consultant into the initial design process. So you can see there's an overlapping here, timing of when do you actually bring them in, when is it prudent to bring them in. Not too late, I hope, otherwise you've missed the boat. I would also suggest you assess this requirement at the front end of the design process, namely pre-feasibility and during feasibility stage, because your site may have suspected soil contamination, for instance, or asbestos content perhaps. Equally, you may determine you will need some crucial measurements and levels at the front end of your design process, and you will have to explain to your client that and obtain your client approval, because there is a cost implication for this information up front. And you'll find that some clients will say, can you not do that? And you can, well, you know, you have to be a bit careful about certain aspects of information you're going to put in to your initial feasibility considerations and then onto your concept development. You do need at times, depending on the nature of the project, that level of expertise, which is not your gift, it's the gift of another specialist. I will refer to this again when we are focusing on the feasibility study in depth, which is a future video in this series. So I hope by now you have noticed that I do not refer to obtaining planning permission. And the reason is very simple. It is because you are not in a position to offer your client a guarantee, since the UK planning system is discretionary and not regulatory. I will refer to this specific topic in a later video again as part of this series, because it is important to be able to distinguish and differentiate between the two and indeed what they mean. Now, what I'm about to tell you in the next 3 slides, I think, is important. So I want you to listen up. With all that is happening during the time of your initial engagement with your client that I referred to in the previous slides, and getting the feel of what your client is seeking to achieve, you need to have in the back of your thinking, the back of your mind, the notion of formalizing your working arrangement as soon as possible. This should have a place of priority. I can't overemphasize it. I'm going to keep emphasizing it. So this is what we are going to discuss next in this video, because this is what comes next in the appointment process, and that is even before you become involved in detailed research for preparing the planning submission. So at this point now, I really want to take some time just to highlight when you are officially responsible. Now that I've introduced you to the RIBA work stages 1 to 2, that's the 0, 1 and 2. They're the first 3 stages. And some of the other players that you might have to collaborate with as part of your appointment, I now want to bring your attention to the architect's appointment again. And I referred to this earlier in the slide, if you remember, how important it is. It is important to keep your architect's appointment in your thinking when you are charged with delivering a project as a qualified architect. Others might get away with it who are not qualified. Architectural designers, architectural consultants, and the like. You know what I mean. They are not qualified architects in a conventional sense that I am referring to here, and why you're spending the best part of 7 years, maybe less, maybe more, depends on how clever we all are, but it's usually a minimum of 7 in any event, to get qualified. And that's an investment that you've put in to your profession, and that should be recognized. Now, understanding the process also means keeping yourself organized. There we go again, organized. It's so important, because it's important to keep yourself organized for your project and to keep your project under control, and knowing what your professional responsibilities are as a practicing architect. You need to have a grip on this from the very beginning. That is when you are discussing the project with your client for the very first time. Your project really begins at this point with your client. When you have your initial discussion, you're gathering your thoughts, you're trying to position yourself, what's going to happen here, what this could mean for you as the architect in practice, and indeed what you would be expected to provide. And you need to think about, is your practice set up, geared up to be able to provide that? And if not, do you have to bring in more staff? Do you have to reorganize in some way to accommodate this project? Maybe it's a project you might say, oh, it's a bit big for me, I'm not able for that. Most of us tend not to say that for obvious reasons. We say, well, we'll find a way of doing it, and we do. So just a quick reminder to orientate yourself with where you are. In the first video, I'm concentrating, providing you with information relating to the business elements connected with starting a project with your client. And then I am focusing on what I believe is important for you to have in place even before you start getting down to the real work on the project. And the real work we might all suggest is the design work. Let's get down to that. That's where the fun is. Of course it is. I understand that. So I want to make sure that you have organize yourself correctly, that you are indeed in control of the process. And this means having a formal arrangement in place with the client. I can't overemphasize that. You must get that in place, some form of words. You may be watching this video because you're already engaging on a project with your client. Perhaps you are not certain at what point you should introduce the subject of your appointment and formalizing your arrangement of the project and your project activities in some way. Maybe too, you've not yet discussed your fee charges either, and neither does your client know what to expect from you. I want you to consider your situation with regard to your architect's appointment. I referred to this earlier, as you know, if you recall. So let me ask you now, have you actually got an architect's appointment in place? Do you have anything in place with your client? You must have some form of agreement in place before you undertake any work, paid or not. If you are working on a goodwill basis, hoping for your appointment will follow and payment will be made and all will be well because there's mutual trust, you are already in deep trouble. I have to tell you that, because you're not complying with the ARB rules. You could very well be disappointed with regard to realizing any expected fees and potentially land yourself in difficulty, professionally that is, and having to explain yourself to the ARB. That is not a good place to be. You've got to avoid that. That's trouble from the beginning. You have to rectify that situation, and before you become too involved with the project, because your understanding and expectations of professional services you intend to provide may well differ from that expected by your client, and that is a risk you should avoid. Moreover, you are in breach of the ARB Code of Conduct 4.4. It states quite clearly, something that you are expected that before you undertake any professional work, you have entered into some form of a written agreement with the client, and which adequately covers the contracting parties, that's you and the client, the scope of the work, that's the nature and the complexity I referred to earlier, and the fees or method of calculating fees, whether it's on a fixed fee or a time charging, and who will be responsible for what. Now, there's a list of other requirements, that you need to refer to under this section 4.4 that you really must not ignore. You need to be alert to what's going on there. And just to add some spicy sauce to this, would you please refer to my article number 1, which sets out why you are exposed professionally if you do not have some form of arrangement in writing between you and your client. And this article 1 is the very first article I wrote, actually, because I thought it was so important, but it actually provides you with a pretty potent wake-up call. If this article 1 provides you with a wake-up call, then this video will have done a great job. You'll find it on our website, and I'll place a link for that below in the description as well. The article will give you a very good overview of what the judge has to say to an architect. If you've ever been in a court situation in your professional capacity, I have on numerous occasions, not on the wrong side, I'm not saying thank heavens, but it's a wake-up call, I can tell you. But Article 1 will tell you what the judge had to say in a particular case where no written arrangement was in place between the architect and their client. The architect believed the appointment situation to be one thing, and the client, though, decided to challenge that understanding because it suited them. So you can't just take everything for granted. The big takeaway, therefore, is this, that was the architect really the architect? Now, if you read that article, I think you'll find it very interesting. At the very least, you must have an exchange of letters, as I said before. They must be in place between you and your client, setting out the basic services will be and the fees that you'll be charging. And when you read my article, you will understand why this is hyper important. A simple exchange of letters will suffice for the initial stages of the project for your RIBA stage 0 to 1. In actual fact, within your own mind, this is usually where you should begin with your project. Get something in writing early, in work stage 0, so you're in a good place. So let me tell you the way I approach matters with a new client, and the very initial stages of the projects is crucial for this. Even clients I have worked with previously know what to expect from me, and I'm of course thrilled when they come back and say, you know, we've had good fun with you on the first project, let's do another one, and that's always a very satisfying position to be in. So the first thing I would say is have the initial meeting to discuss the project in general terms. This will be your initial project briefing meeting with the client. And then the next thing I would say, B, maybe, seek to identify aspects relating to work stage 0 and 1 with your client. You just refer to the RIBA work stages. It tells you what it is. The next thing I would say would be, these will usually relate to the general development and project matters, and then of course matters relating to the building specifically. Things such as the building's function, specific areas within the building, and perhaps how certain areas might need to relate to one another. That's spatial relationships, etc. Or indeed you might have to do some research on that on behalf of the client as well, so as to make sure that the client is getting the best value for their money. In other words, you have getting a good grasp of the client's intention, that is the broad outline of the project objectives, forming your initial project brief. So you're beginning to sort of generate a brief at this stage, and it has sufficient detail for you to set out in a simple letter what your input as the architect would be to cover work stages 0 and 1. Essentially, you'll have sufficient information to cover general briefing for the project, but which further briefing detail will need to be added to it later. That's normal. That's normal. There's nothing unusual about that. The brief will evolve, but you need something to start with, and you need that document in writing. You will also, of course, set out your fee charges, which might be on an hourly charge rate, or it might be for a fixed fee. I will be referring to this again in this video, so I will also be suggesting the best time for you to get your working arrangement finalized between you and your client. Your formal working arrangement with your client for the initial stages 0 and 1 will generally consist of the following. Let's say I'll just give you a rundown of what I think. There would be develop the project brief with the client, assemble site information. You'd be developing a feasibility study. This would be is to verify sketches, maybe to verify the viability of the intended project on a number of levels, such as cost, project risks, initial site survey information, for instance, general site appraisal, early planning observations, indications, just basic facts of what you might know about that. In fact, this information, together with your initial design thoughts, are in place for you to develop a concept design for the project when you arrive at that. And this comes later, and it comes in work stage 2. So identify then your project. You'll also in stage 0 and 1 be identifying your project budget, of course. What did I not think of that? Your project budget, you know, it's all down to cost, and your client will need to have some handle on that as well. And you need a strategy for doing that. Set out a project program is always a good thing. What your expectations are, what you feel you can deliver, what your client is, and how you're going to marry into those client expectations. And then you, of course, you'll have a conversation about project procurement. And again, depending on the nature of what you're designing, how you're designing it, will dictate, you know, the project procurement strategy. And then, of course, roles and responsibilities. Remember, I referred earlier to there are other players. So these other players will have roles and responsibilities, and as you will, as a client will, and how they all overlap and interact with one another. So you need to have a sort of a general overview of what to expect from that as well. And then any further information requirements would come into that mix. So armed with all of the above information, which is sufficient in detail for the client to decide whether or not to proceed to the next work stage, which is work stage 2. And then with work stage 0 and 1 activity drawing to a close, will mean verifying the viability of the project to your client by way of the feasibility studies. And this will be the time for you to transition from a simple exchange of letters between you and your client to perhaps a more formal architect's appointment document. Now, that would be, let's say, during the latter part of work stage 1, when you are concluding on the feasibility. By that I mean you are verifying the project's viability with your client, and you will have done that with conversations, discussion, gathering information, and maybe some simple sketches just to give a visual impression of how things could work. So you're not doing, for your feasibility study does not mean you're doing concept development and proving that the whole thing works. You're just verifying the viability of the project and that, yes, that's feasible. So this is the time when I begin introducing my clients to the necessity for a full architect's appointment being in place. That way, all is in place and ready to proceed with the RIBA stage 2, which is the concept design development. And both parties are clear on what is expected. So you've done all your feasibility work, you've checked the viability, and now you can get down to some serious concept development. And that's really where an architect comes into their own, there's no doubt. And until you have your client's written instruction to proceed with work stage 2, I would ask you not to venture off developing detailed design thoughts and ideas and about a project, or setting out any detailed advice in any form that is not really your project until you have some formal arrangement in place. The client has no commitment to you until you have that formal arrangement in place. You will understand better why you should be careful about giving free advice, of course, when you read the article I referred to earlier. So please make sure you don't wander off and start giving shall we say, free advice, which is even worse, on a goodwill basis. It doesn't exist. Just get that out of your vocabulary. Okay, good. So what are we going to move on to next? We're going to discuss what your project brief means, because it's good to have a good fix and bolt that down as much as possible. Now, because of that, I want to spend a little time dealing with the project brief, what it means and how it comes about. In the previous 2 slides, I was outlining the essence associated with your architect's appointment, and rightly so, and it being a formal document setting out the terms of your engagement with your client. Now, equally, the project brief is a formal document, and it will sit alongside your architect's appointment. Essentially, the project brief describes what is required for the project, and the architect's appointment sets out your design services and how you will deliver them for the agreed fee. That is your services. Now, as the architect for the project, you need to know what is required for the project, for the design and specification purposes, and the building design in particular. You need to make certain that your client is clear as to the options that may exist for the proposed development on the site in question, and this needs to be documented, therefore, by way of a project brief, which will be approved by your client also in writing. So that's why the two of them sit together as signed documents. At the very initial stages of the project, your client may not know the full extent of what may or may not be required to develop the site, and that's not unreasonable. Your client must have a vision of what is required or preferred, and it is this. Scoping out the brief is a very important aspect of the project for you, the architect, and indeed for your client. The time required for preparing and finalizing a project brief will be dictated, of course, by the nature of the project itself and what the client is seeking to achieve. There must be a project brief if you are to know what your client requires and what is deemed correct for the development. And it is incumbent upon you as the architect to make sure the project brief exists, really. And you've got to manage that process. The project brief really is it's a document that really is beyond the design requirements. As you engage with your client through work stage 0 and 1, you will gather a better understanding as to what your client is looking for and will need in order to achieve a successful project. You will also get to know what the project objectives are. You're in the mix, you know what's going on. And make sure you are in the mix, by the way, keep in the mix. You also be asking questions, and indeed plenty of questions. This will provide you with a very good understanding as to the nature and extent of your commission as the architect and what you believe is expected from you by your client. In actual fact, you are seeking to create that project brief. You will naturally assume you will function as the architect, but does the nature and extent of the project necessitate you being identified as the lead design consultant? Remember, I referred to that earlier. You will have a reasonable good idea about this classification, but it's really, you know, it's just for you to be able to get things clear in your head, how you're going to function on this project. If there are other players, as I said, you're the lead design consultant. You have to coordinate not only what you believe to be the architectural design, but other specialist design elements as well. So you become more acquainted with the meaning of the project at your first briefing meeting, when the essence of the project is usually discussed. And given the nature of the project, that is its size again and level of complexity, you will know by this time whether your client will be engaging a project manager and other personnel to assist the client with his project, and they will be on the client side, as it were. Therefore, getting briefed on your project will not just be about design issues. You will also need to know about your client's intention with regard to engaging other personnel and specialist consultants, perhaps, as this too will need to be included within your architect's appointment. So I would suggest for a simple, small size projects, a project manager or specialist design consultants may not necessarily be involved, which would suggest you are going to manage the total design process for the project and for your client. Your appointment will set out the extent then to which you will assist the client to manage the project, or perhaps your client will explicitly request you to take on the project management role, as well as you acting as the architect, lead design consultant, all of which should be set out in your architect's appointment, of course, and the fees reflected accordingly. You can see now why an architect's appointment document is important. It sets out the nature and extent of your service and what's expected. And you need to have that in place from the word go, in my opinion. I always make sure I do, for sure. Deciding what should be included in your architect's appointment is a topic for another video, so I will deal with that separately then. It's so much to go into that it does warrant a separate video. Okay, so I'm going to move on then to the types of briefing information that you might expect. I always make a point of engaging with the client on this important aspect of the project. Sometimes it falls to the architect to introduce a measure of discipline when formulating the project brief and helping your client to differentiate between their wish list and a must-have list. which is to be included in the project. You know, affordability comes into it, and I've had many an interesting conversation with my clients when it comes down to affordability. So creating a project brief for a single residential development will not be too difficult for your client, because it is usually very personal to them, and as such we'll be able to provide you with a very good account of what they require. But of course, inside of all that, depending on how they're fixed financially, will dictate whether they can, you know, realize their goals and aspirations in that regard. But you, however, as the architect, may need to clarify certain aspects for your client and provide your views, some possible alternatives perhaps, as to what might be more practical, might be more cost efficient perhaps, and even a better plan arrangement for that matter. This is where converting a wish list into reality becomes necessary to keep within the budget. But you'll get a handle on that when you start discussing finances with the client. On larger projects, of course, or a building is not familiar to your client, the situation will be different, in that your client may not even know for sure what actual spaces are required, their sizes, etc. Specific activities within those spaces may be required, and may require further design research, such as special spatial arrangements and options, etc. And that too is normal to a degree. Now, an example of this would be where we were working with our client on a new sports club, which had to be made accessible to the public. An example of this would be the funding that was being made available to them, and an agreement had to be reached for the size and use of shared use spaces for many of the internal spaces, not so much externally but mostly internally. Finalizing this project brief was a big investment of time. I would not commence with the concept design development stage, that is work stage 2, until the project brief was brought to a sensible conclusion, albeit the project brief continued to be amended and updated and refined to a certain extent during the concept design stage, because the project does evolve with the generation of the concept design development. Clarity begins to seep in, if not common sense sometimes. So the difference with what I have just cited as an example and a developer client engaging with you on a residential project will probably be vastly different. In my experience, the developer clients with a focus on residential projects or building types they are familiar with will most probably have a clear understanding of what is involved and what is required before they even engage you as their architect. They have a very good idea. At this point, I just want to give you a general overview of the briefing process and really taking ownership of that process as well. It is always tempting at some point during the project briefing process for enthusiastic architects to charge off and start producing detailed plan layouts with some elevational treatments ahead of the correct time. But really, this is usually a waste of time in my experience, because really you are designing in a vacuum, because you haven't got all your ducks lined up. You haven't done your research at this stage. I've seen it happen in my own practice, and we've had to acquaint our enthusiastic architects and creatives with the correct process, and without, of course, quenching their eagerness and excitement. I mean, we're all excited about new projects. We like to get on with it, but we need to know what we're designing for. So you cannot sensibly start identifying a design solution or what even might be a design option without a sensible project brief and without your site research or your planning research in some order. My approach was to always seek to formalize the brief with the client as much as possible and sufficient for it to be realistic and sensible. This usually meant arranging a series of meetings to get the briefing job done. I mean, it is a job that has to be done, and you've got to make sure that you've got a brief, and so it falls into your remit to make sure a brief exists. Now, at my briefing meetings, I would have a sketch pad and pen and sketch out some ideas and indicative spatial arrangements for the client. And I may not be I may not be at these meetings on my own. I could be with an architect colleague of mine, or two maybe. But just to put some meaning into what was being discussed, this was always very advantageous to be able to discuss things with very loose sketches. And I keep these sketches as part of my briefing document also. Now, these are great opportunities for you to for you and indeed your client to take ownership of the project together. And I always found that that is a very useful thing to make sure that your client and you as the architect have a good handle on what's going to happen and that you've decided on things together. That's what I mean by taking ownership. Your client too will gather a great overview of what to expect when you actually get down to preparing some concept ideas in a more formal sense, and will be more inclined to understand where you're coming from because you've already done some initial discussions together. And why not? Bear in mind, your client may not be a single individual. Your client could be a committee or a trust whereby you are speaking and meeting with a number of interested players and having to answer numerous questions at the same briefing meeting. And you need to have a style to be able to manage that process, and maybe we can talk about that some other time, maybe in a webinar. That'd be great fun. I think, yes, we might do that. I always manage the process the same way, however, irrespective of how many people attend my briefing meetings. Now notice I've called them my briefing meetings because I've got a job of work to do. I don't let anybody else sort of hijack those meetings because I need to achieve what I've set out to achieve. You'll find that informed clients and clients familiar with the type of buildings and use they require will probably have a simple briefing document maybe to give you from the outset. Now, I found that from a number of occasions, and it's very, very helpful indeed. Something to build with, something to test in the concept design stage as well. It might be a simple schedule of areas setting out the number of spaces they require. You might be presented with a specification document or a sample product or system the client have in mind, which of course you will incorporate as part of your client's briefing information, but naturally you will do some further research later in the design process to make sure this client information is appropriate and cost effective for the project compared to an alternative perhaps. You might be provided with some room data sheets setting out what needs to be included in various rooms and spaces, but your client is looking to you really to provide the most suitable arrangement and up-to-date information and arrangement of spaces as his architect or her architect or their architect, as the case may be. Now, a client seeking to reconfigure an existing building in addition to a new building element might have some initial thoughts and ideas to share with you, and whilst you will take this information on board, there will always be justification for testing these arrangements. In fact, that is usually expected from the client, and you too as the architect will naturally have to expect that your client will be giving their own views and thoughts, goals and aspirations, and really it is incumbent upon you as their architect to try and deliver those in the most pragmatic, sensible, cost-efficient way. That's your job as the architect, and that's what you're expected to do. Now, once I have a grip of the brief, and my client too, of course, I would then make a point of writing up the brief to formalize what has been discussed and agreed, to be included in the design and specification of the building, that is, and for the project generally. I would then submit the written project brief for the client's written approval of this written document. So that would be then a good place to move on to the next slide, when I'm going to talk about once the formalities are in place, you're in a reasonably good place to start doing what you should be doing. That's designing. Now, I do recognize there is a measure of cajoling and keeping the project momentum flowing that the architect needs to do in order to keep the projects alive and under control. Now, when I say alive, to keep the projects in existence, because it can slip if you don't keep things under control. This is nonetheless a good and sometimes necessary investment of time, this project briefing and meeting, etc. When it comes to securing that big prize project and making sure all the parts are in place and you are adding value to the project for your client. Now, I just want to take another minute here just to highlight the fact that if a client sees that your approach to things is a bit raggedy and a bit disorganized and a bit, not too sure about what you're doing, it doesn't inspire confidence. I can assure you, if you are demonstrating that you're taking the projects and leading by the scruff of the neck, it inspires confidence. And you have to get into that frame of mind, to succeed in winning projects and managing projects in a successful way. So usually around the same time of finalizing the briefs, I think I referred to this earlier, finalizing the brief for a client's approval, I will also seek to formalize my terms of engagement with a simple exchange of letters for the first time. Now, this is after the brief is done and before you do any sort of concept design stuff. You've done your initial feasibility, you've worked with the client on stage 0, 1, 1, and you're doing that on a time charge basis with a simple exchange of letters. So depending on the nature of the project and the politics that prevail, believe me, politics do prevail in a project, and you have to mind your P's and Q's there to make sure you step on the right toes and shake the right hands, as it were. I might also submit my full architect's appointment to cover the entire project, and this is all the work for all the work stages, that is up to 6 and 7. Now, the lifespan of the project can be influenced by planning decision outcome, and whether the client wishes to continue with the project will it's either because a planning permission will not be forthcoming after all your hard endeavour and the client's perseverance, but with the planning permission achieved, the client decides to sell on the project. And I mentioned that also earlier on. Whilst you should always try to make sure you are novated to the new owner, there's no guarantee, however, that the new owner will continue with your professional services, because they, sometimes have their own architects, and that's their preference, that's their gift. So your architect's appointment should include the briefing document information, including the sketches, and the client has already approved. Of course, I remember I mentioned that the sketches, they're all approved as forming part of the briefing document, and the specifications, of course, that you might have referred to, or any of the products or services, products or systems rather, the client might have asked for specifically. It's incumbent upon you to investigate that, interrogate, to make sure that's a viable proposition. So with your client's appointment completed and the project brief in place alongside it to cover the extent of the work, that's your work, your architect's work that is required, you will then engage on work stage 1 as the first milestone. That will be followed by you undertaking concept design development then, and prepare and make a planning submission. So there's a process there that you're going to follow. With your architect's appointment in place, of course, your client is clear about what to expect from you in terms of your role and responsibilities as the architect stroke lead design consultant. Now, just to clarify for you again, have a simple exchange of letters or a formal agreement in place with your client, setting out what your architect services will provide and what the fees that you will be charging and what they will cover for the various events to be completed. The early stages of the project usually follow a set pattern, and this is sort of a culmination of what I've been saying in this video so far. So work stage 0 is really the strategic brief and just planning. The client is thinking you may be involved with that, you may not be, sometimes you are, and just the strategic planning associated with the project. Work stage 1 is really where you come into the mix, and that is discussing the project with your client, and you formulate a project brief. You do the brief preparation with your client, and you get it signed off by the client. And then work stage 2 would be your concept design development to completing a design solution. And also within work stage 2 is preparing and making a planning submission, which is the final design solution. But within that, you, of course, you'll be going through a pre-planning application, which I'll discuss. Now, the client is also very clear about his or her role and responsibilities to the architect also. It's a contract, after all, between you and your client. Now, this is where the architect needs to be. If ever they have to explain their activities to an ARB complaints committee. What? Complaints? From who, I hear you saying. So I will discuss that topic in a later videos. But if you do look after managing your project correctly and making sure you've got your letters of appointment, initial letter of appointment, or a full architect's appointment in place, then you are good to go. You can sleep at night, and that's important. If you can go through your architectural career without your client finding themselves having to challenge a party connected with the project, or a party connected with the project seeking to challenge your client, I would say you've had a successful career, because it would be down to how the projects are managed and documented. Now, I've got a final word that I think is very important that I want to mention. Just a big thank you from me also for watching. I'm so grateful. I hope you found it interesting as well. You can watch further videos like this by subscribing and hitting the bell. I think there's a process for that. That way you will be certain you will get notified when the next video is published. Oh, hang on a second. Mario has just nodded to me just now. I've just told him you've already liked it with the button. Now, we've created an article on this video as well. It would be very useful reference to have at your fingertips. I'll put the link in the video below. Okay guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Bye for now. Have a great week ahead. Bye.